Eleanor Bennett had spent most of her life trying to stay invisible. She worked at a small public library in a quiet town in Ohio. Every morning, she arrived early, organized the shelves, helped visitors find books, and spoke only when someone asked her a question. She was 34 years old, lived alone in a tiny apartment, and had very few friends. But there was one thing that made her heart beat faster. One thing that made her forget how lonely her life had become, and that was music. Every Sunday, Eleanor sat in the back row of Grace Community Church. She never spoke to anyone. She never stayed for coffee after the service. But she always stayed for the choir. The moment those voices filled the room, something inside her woke up. She would close her eyes and let the sound wash over her like warm water. It reminded her of her childhood. It reminded her of someone she had lost a long time ago. And every single week, she left the church with the same quiet wish buried deep in her chest. She wanted to be part of that choir. She wanted to sing with them. She wanted to belong somewhere. But wanting something and doing something about it are two very different things. Eleanor had been afraid her whole life. Afraid of being noticed. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of failing in front of others. So she kept her dream locked away, year after year, telling herself that someday she would be brave enough to try. Then one Sunday, the pastor made an announcement. The choir was holding open auditions. They were looking for new voices. Anyone who loved to sing was welcome to come and try out. Eleanor felt her stomach flip. Her hands started to shake. A small voice in her head told her this was her chance. Another voice, louder and meaner, told her she would only embarrass herself. For 3 days, she went back and forth. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She practiced singing softly in her bathroom, stopping every time she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. On the morning of the audition, she almost did not go. She stood in front of her mirror, staring at her plain face and messy hair, and thought about staying home. But then, she remembered her grandmother. She remembered sitting beside her on a piano bench as a little girl, learning to play, learning to love music. Her grandmother had always told her that music was a gift, and gifts were meant to be shared. So Eleanor put on her best dress, a faded blue one she had worn to her cousin's wedding 5 years ago, and walked to the church. When she arrived, her heart sank. There were at least 20 people waiting in the fellowship hall. Most of them looked confident. Some were chatting and laughing like old friends. A few were warming up their voices, hitting notes that sounded perfect to Eleanor's ears. She felt completely out of place. She wanted to turn around and leave. But before she could move, someone called her name. Actually, no one called her name. A woman at the front of the room clapped her hands and told everyone to sit down. The auditions were about to begin. The woman's name was Patricia Holloway. She was the choir director. Eleanor had seen her many times from her seat in the back pew, but she had never spoken to her. Patricia was tall, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a dark blazer and held a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her face was sharp and serious. She did not smile. Not once. One by one, people stood up and sang. Some were good, some were not. Patricia made notes on her clipboard after each one, her expression never changing. Eleanor watched and waited, her heart pounding louder with every passing minute. When her turn finally came, her legs felt like they were made of stone. She walked to the front of the room. 20 pairs of eyes followed her. Patricia looked up from her clipboard and studied her for a long moment. "Name?" she asked. "Eleanor Bennett," she said quietly. "Speak up." "I can barely hear you." "Eleanor Bennett," she repeated, louder this time, her cheeks burning. Patricia wrote something down. "Have you ever sung in a choir before?" "No, ma'am." "Any musical training at all?" Eleanor hesitated. She thought about the piano. She thought about her grandmother's hands, guiding hers across the keys. She thought about the years she had spent playing, practicing, dreaming. But that was a long time ago. That was a different life. "I can play piano a little," she said softly. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "A little? What does that mean? Can you read music or not?" "I can. I just have not played in a while." Patricia let out a short laugh. It was not a kind laugh. "Well, we are not looking for piano players. We have a pianist. We need singers. So, let us see what you can do." Eleanor nodded. Her throat felt dry. The room was too quiet. She opened her mouth and began to sing the hymn she had prepared. But her voice came out weak and shaky. She forgot some of the words. She went flat on the high notes. She could feel everyone staring at her, and it made everything worse. By the time she finished, she was almost in tears. Patricia did not say anything for a few seconds. She just looked at Eleanor with something between pity and annoyance. Then she sighed. "Well," she said slowly, "that was certainly something." A few people in the room laughed quietly. Eleanor felt her face go red. "I appreciate you coming out," Patricia continued, "but I think you might want to stick to your day job." "What is it you do again?" "I work at the library," Eleanor whispered. "Ah, a librarian. That makes sense. You seem like someone who is more comfortable with books than with people." More laughter. Louder this time. Eleanor wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She managed to say thank you, though she did not know why, and walked quickly toward the door. Her vision was blurry with tears. She pushed through the exit and stepped outside into the cold morning air. But just before the door closed behind her, she heard Patricia's voice one more time. "Some people are just not meant for music," she was saying to someone. "It is better they find out now than waste everyone's time." Eleanor stopped walking. She stood there on the sidewalk, her hands trembling, those words echoing in her mind. Some people are just not meant for music. She had heard those words before. Not from Patricia, from someone else, a long time ago. And in that moment, something inside Eleanor began to shift. The sadness did not go away, but underneath it, something else started to rise. Something she had not felt in years. It was anger. And it was just the beginning. Eleanor did not go to work the next day. She called in sick for the first time in 6 years. She stayed in bed until noon, staring at the ceiling, replaying every terrible moment of that audition in her head. Patricia's cold eyes, the laughter from the crowd, the way her voice had cracked and trembled like a broken instrument, and those words, those awful words that followed her home and refused to leave. Some people are just not meant for music. She had heard something like that before. 20 years ago, from a man named Richard Price. Richard Price had been her piano teacher in college. Eleanor had arrived at that school, full of hope. She had been playing piano since she was 5 years old. Her grandmother, a woman named Helen Chen, had taught her everything she knew. Helen had been a concert pianist back in China before she came to America. She had performed in grand halls in front of hundreds of people. She had hands that moved like water across the keys, making sounds that could break your heart or lift your spirit. And when Eleanor was born, Helen made it her mission to pass that gift along. Every afternoon after school, Eleanor would sit beside her grandmother on the piano bench. Helen was patient and kind. She never raised her voice. She never made Eleanor feel stupid when she made mistakes. Instead, she would smile and say, "Try again, little one. The music is already inside you. You just have to let it out." And Eleanor did. By the time she was 10, she was playing pieces that most adults could not handle. By 14, she had won 3 regional piano competitions. By 17, she was offered a scholarship to study music at a small but respected college in Pennsylvania. Her grandmother cried the day she left for school. She held Eleanor's face in her hands and said, "You have a gift. Never let anyone take it from you." But someone did. Richard Price was a famous piano teacher. He had trained students who went on to play in orchestras around the world. When Eleanor was assigned to study under him, she felt like the luckiest girl alive. But Richard was not like her grandmother. He was harsh. He was cold. He believed that greatness could only be forged through suffering. He would sit beside her during lessons and point out every tiny flaw in her playing. He would sigh loudly when she made a mistake. He would roll his eyes and shake his head like she was wasting his time. At first, Eleanor tried harder. She practiced for hours every day, sometimes until her fingers bled. But nothing she did was ever good enough for Richard. He told her she had no soul. He told her she played like a machine. He told her she would never be anything more than average. And one afternoon, after she stumbled through a Chopin piece she had been working on for weeks, he leaned back in his chair and said the words that destroyed her. "You do not have what it takes. Some people are born for music. You are not one of them. You should quit now before you embarrass yourself any further." Eleanor left his studio that day and never went back. She dropped out of the music program. She switched to library science because it was quiet and safe, and nobody would ever judge her again. She stopped playing piano completely. She told herself it was for the best. She told herself Richard was right. She told herself the dream was over. And then her grandmother died. Helen passed away 2 years after Eleanor left the music program. She had been sick for a while, but she never told anyone how bad it was. She did not want to be a burden. Eleanor flew home for the funeral and sat in the front row of the church, numb with grief. She did not cry. She could not cry. She just sat there, staring at the coffin, thinking about all the songs they would never play together again. After the service, Eleanor went to her grandmother's house to help sort through her belongings. That was when she found it, hidden under a white sheet in the corner of the living room. A piano, not just any piano. A vintage Steinway grand that Helen had brought with her from China over 50 years ago. It was beautiful. Dark wood, ivory keys, a little worn around the edges, but still elegant, still full of memories. Eleanor could not bring herself to sell it. She had it shipped to her apartment in Ohio, even though she had no room for it. She squeezed it into her tiny living room and covered it with a sheet, just like her grandmother had done. And for 12 years, she never touched it. Not once. She walked past it every day, pretending it was not there. Pretending it did not call out to her in the middle of the night. Pretending she did not miss the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. But on the night after that audition, something changed. Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in bed for hours, tossing and turning, her mind spinning with anger and shame. She kept hearing Patricia's voice. She kept hearing Richard's voice. She kept hearing every cruel word anyone had ever said to her about her music. And then, somewhere around 2 in the morning, she heard something else. A melody, soft and distant, like it was coming from another room. It was Chopin. The same piece Richard had destroyed her over all those years ago. She sat up in bed. The apartment was silent. The melody was not real. It was only a memory. But it pulled her out of bed anyway. It pulled her down the hallway, past the kitchen, into the living room, where the piano sat waiting in the dark. Eleanor stood there for a long time, her heart pounding. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and pulled the sheet away. The piano looked exactly the same as it had in her grandmother's house. She ran her fingers along the wood, feeling the grooves and scratches that told the story of its long life. She sat down on the bench. She placed her hands on the keys, and for a moment, she was 5 years old again, sitting beside her grandmother, hearing her voice say, "The music is already inside you. You just have to let it out." Eleanor pressed down on the first key, then the second, then the third, and before she knew it, she was playing. Not just a few notes, not just a simple tune. She was playing Chopin's Ballet No. 1 from start to finish, her fingers flying across the keys like they had never stopped. The music poured out of her like a river breaking through a dam. 12 years of silence. 12 years of pain. 12 years of hiding from who she really was. All of it came rushing out through the piano. When the last note faded into the air, Eleanor realized she was crying. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto the keys. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. Tears of release. Tears of something that had been buried for far too long, finally coming back to life. She sat there in the darkness, her hands trembling, her chest heaving. And for the first time in years, she heard her grandmother's voice again. Not in a memory, not in a dream, but somewhere deep inside her heart. "You have a gift," the voice said. "Never let anyone take it from you." Eleanor wiped her eyes and looked at the piano. Patricia had mocked her. Richard had broken her. But they had only seen part of who she was. They had only heard her voice. They had never heard her play. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to change that. The next morning, Eleanor woke up with sore fingers and swollen eyes. She had stayed at the piano until almost 4 in the morning, playing piece after piece, crying and laughing, and feeling things she had not allowed herself to feel in over a decade. Her body was exhausted, but her spirit felt strangely alive. For the first time in years, she did not dread getting out of bed. She did not feel empty inside. She felt like something had woken up. Something important. She went to work that day and did her job like always. She smiled at the visitors. She organized the shelves. She answered questions about book locations and library cards, but the whole time, her mind was somewhere else. It was back at the piano. It was with her grandmother. It was in the music that had been sleeping inside her for so long. That night, she played again, and the night after that, and the night after that. What started as one emotional evening slowly turned into a routine. Every day, Eleanor would come home from work, eat a quick dinner, and sit down at the Steinway. She would play for 3 or 4 hours straight, sometimes longer. She started with the pieces she remembered from her childhood. Simple melodies her grandmother had taught her. Scales and exercises that brought back the muscle memory in her fingers. Then, as the weeks passed, she moved on to harder things. She pulled out old sheet music she had kept in a box under her bed. Rachmaninoff, Liszt, Debussy. Pieces that used to terrify her. Pieces that Richard Price had told her she would never be good enough to play. She attacked them one by one, practicing the same passages over and over until her hands ached and her back was stiff from sitting. Some nights she got frustrated and wanted to quit. Some nights the old voices came back, telling her she was wasting her time. But every time she felt like giving up, she would close her eyes and picture her grandmother sitting beside her, smiling, saying, "Try again, little one. The music is already inside you." Every time, late, to the towel. 3 months passed. Eleanor did not tell anyone what she was doing. Not her co-workers at the library. Not her neighbors. Not even her cousin who called every few weeks to check on her. This was her secret, her private battle. She was not ready to share it with the world yet. She was not ready to be judged again. But she kept going to church every Sunday. She still sat in the back row. She still watched the choir perform. And she still listened to Patricia Holloway give orders and make announcements like she was the queen of the whole congregation. It was hard to be in the same room as the woman who had humiliated her. Every time Eleanor saw Patricia's face, she felt a flash of anger in her chest. But she did not leave. She did not hide. She stayed and watched and waited, though she did not know what she was waiting for. One thing she started to notice was the pianist. His name was Arthur Webb. He was an older man, probably in his late 70s, with white hair and kind eyes. He had been playing for the church for over 30 years. Everyone loved him. He was gentle and humble, and always had a warm word for anyone who passed by. But lately, something was different. Eleanor could see it in the way he moved his hands. They were slower than before, stiffer. Sometimes he missed notes or played the wrong chord. Sometimes he winced like his fingers were hurting him. At first, she thought it was just a bad day. But week after week, the same thing happened. Arthur would sit at the piano and struggle through the hymns, simplifying the arrangements because his hands could not keep up. Patricia would glance at him with frustration, but say nothing. The choir members would exchange looks, but stay quiet. Nobody wanted to embarrass the old man. But everyone could see the truth. Arthur was slowing down. One Sunday after the service, Eleanor stayed a little longer than usual. She was pretending to read a bulletin by the door when she overheard voices coming from the hallway near the pastor's office. She recognized Patricia's voice immediately. Sharp, impatient, demanding. "We cannot go on like this," Patricia was saying. "The Regional Gospel Music Festival is in 2 months. Do you understand what that means? This is the biggest event of the year. Churches from 5 states are competing. And our pianist can barely get through a simple hymn without making mistakes." Another voice responded. It was softer, calmer. Eleanor leaned closer and realized it was Pastor Thomas, the head of the church. "Patricia, Arthur has given his life to this church. We owe him some respect. I am not saying we throw him out on the street. I am saying we need a backup plan. Someone who can actually play at a professional level. If we go to that festival with Arthur at the piano, we will embarrass ourselves in front of everyone." There was a pause. Then Pastor Thomas sighed. "Arthur came to see me yesterday. He told me his arthritis has gotten worse. His doctor says he needs to rest his hands or risk permanent damage. He is stepping down from the piano. Effective immediately." Eleanor felt her heart skip. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, listening to every word. Patricia let out a frustrated groan. "This is a disaster. Where are we supposed to find a pianist now? Someone good enough to handle our repertoire? Someone who can learn everything in 2 months? We will put out a call to the congregation. Maybe someone will step forward. And if no one does? What then? We just give up on the festival? After everything we have worked for?" Pastor Thomas did not answer. The conversation ended, and Eleanor heard footsteps moving away. She stayed frozen in place, her mind racing. She thought about Arthur and his tired hands. She thought about the festival Patricia was so desperate to win. She thought about all those Sunday mornings sitting in the back row, dreaming of being part of something bigger. And then she thought about her grandmother, about the Steinway waiting for her at home, about the music that had finally come back to life inside her. For a moment, she imagined herself walking up to Pastor Thomas and offering to help. She imagined sitting at the church piano, playing for the choir, showing everyone what she could really do. But then the fear came rushing back. What if she failed again? What if her hands froze up in front of everyone? What if Patricia laughed at her, the way she had laughed at her during the audition? Eleanor shook her head and walked quickly out of the church. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she was not ready. She told herself there were probably dozens of pianists in town who could do the job better than her. But that night, when she sat down at the Steinway, something felt different. The music came out stronger, fiercer. Every note she played was filled with a fire she had not felt before. She thought about Patricia's cold voice saying some people are just not meant for music. She thought about Richard Price telling her she did not have what it takes. And she played harder, faster, better. By the time she finished, her whole body was shaking. She looked down at her hands, red and sore from hours of practice, and she made a decision. She was not going to hide anymore. She was not going to let fear control her life. She was going to walk into that church and show them exactly who she was. The only question now was whether she had the courage to actually do it. Eleanor spent the next 4 days trying to talk herself out of it. Every morning she woke up and told herself today was the day she would go to the church and offer to play. And every evening, she came home without doing it. The fear was like a heavy stone sitting on her chest. It made it hard to breathe. It made it hard to think. Every time she imagined walking up to Pastor Thomas, her mind would flood with images of everything that could go wrong. Patricia laughing at her, the choir members whispering behind her back, her fingers freezing on the keys while everyone watched in silence. But on the fifth day, something happened that changed everything. She was at the library, sorting through a pile of returned books, when an elderly woman approached her desk. The woman had silver hair and a soft face full of wrinkles. She asked Eleanor to help her find a book about gardening. It was a simple request, nothing unusual. But as Eleanor walked her to the right section, the woman started talking about her life. She said she had always wanted to grow roses, but had been too afraid to try. She thought she would fail. She thought people would judge her. So she waited and waited, year after year, until one day she realized she was 82 years old and had never planted a single seed. "I wasted so much time being scared," the woman said quietly. "Do not make the same mistake I did. Dear, whatever it is you want to do it now. Tomorrow is not promised to anyone." Eleanor handed her the gardening book and watched her walk away. She stood there for a long moment, the woman's words echoing in her head. Tomorrow is not promised to anyone. She thought about her grandmother, who had died without warning. She thought about all the years she had spent hiding from music, hiding from life, hiding from herself. And she realized that, if she kept waiting for the perfect moment, it would never come. That evening, instead of going home, Eleanor drove straight to the church. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. But she did not turn around. She parked in the empty lot, walked up the steps, and pushed open the front door. The church was quiet. Evening light came through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows on the wooden pews. Eleanor walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She did not know where to find Pastor Thomas, but she figured his office was somewhere near the back. She had just reached the front of the sanctuary when she heard voices coming from a side room. She followed the sound and found herself standing outside a partially open door. Inside, she could see Pastor Thomas sitting behind a desk, talking to someone on the phone. He looked tired and worried. She waited until he hung up, then knocked softly on the doorframe. Pastor Thomas looked up, surprised. "Can I help you?" "My name is Eleanor Bennett," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "I attend services here. I sit in the back." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I have seen you. Please, come in. What can I do for you?" Eleanor stepped into the office. Her legs felt weak. Her mouth was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I heard you are looking for a pianist. For the choir. For the festival." Pastor Thomas raised his eyebrows. "That is right. Arthur had to step down for health reasons. We have been searching for a replacement, but so far, no luck." He paused. "Do you know someone who might be interested?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "Me. I would like to audition." The pastor looked at her with a mix of curiosity and doubt. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the room. "You?" Eleanor turned around. Patricia Holloway was standing in the doorway, holding a stack of folders against her chest. Her eyes were narrow, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. She looked at Eleanor the way someone might look at a stain on their favorite shirt. "I remember you," Patricia said slowly. "You auditioned for the choir a few months ago." "The librarian. You said you could play piano a little." Eleanor felt her face grow hot. "That is right." "One." Patricia let out a short laugh. It was the same laugh from the audition. Cold and sharp. "And now you want to be our pianist? For the regional festival? Do you have any idea what kind of skill that requires?" "Patricia," Pastor Thomas said gently, Let us at least hear her out. But Patricia was already shaking her head. Pastor, with all due respect, we do not have time for this. The festival is in 7 weeks. We need a professional, someone with real training, someone who can handle complex arrangements without falling apart. She looked at Eleanor with something close to pity. I am sure you mean well, but this is not some hobby project. This is serious. Eleanor felt the old fear rising in her chest. The urge to apologize and walk away was almost overwhelming. But then she remembered the elderly woman at the library. She remembered her grandmother's voice. She remembered all the nights she had spent alone at the Steinway, playing until her fingers bled, fighting to reclaim something that had been stolen from her. I understand your concern, Eleanor said quietly, but I am asking for a chance. Just one chance. Let me play for you. If I am not good enough, I will leave and never bother you again. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but Pastor Thomas held up his hand. That seems fair to me, he said. What harm can it do to listen? Patricia stared at him for a long moment. Then she sighed and gestured toward the sanctuary. Fine. The piano is out there. Let us get this over with. The three of them walked out of the office and into the main hall. Eleanor's legs felt like they might give out at any second. The piano sat near the front, a beautiful grand that gleamed under the soft evening light. She had seen it every Sunday, from her seat in the back row, but she had never been this close to it before. She sat down on the bench. The wood was smooth and cool beneath her fingers. She placed her hands on the keys and felt a familiar electricity run through her body. This was it. This was the moment she had been practicing for. The moment she had been afraid of. The moment that would change everything. Patricia stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression doubtful. Pastor Thomas sat in the front pew, watching with quiet curiosity. Neither of them spoke. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the little girl who used to sit on the piano bench, dreaming of music. She thought about every cruel word that had ever been spoken to her, every moment of doubt, every night she had cried herself to sleep, believing she was not good enough. And then she let it all go. She pressed down on the first key, then the second, then the third. And suddenly, the music took over. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision that surprised even her. The notes filled the sanctuary like a living thing, bouncing off the walls, rising to the ceiling, filling every corner with sound. She played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. She played it with power. She played it with passion. She played it with everything she had been holding inside for 12 long years. When the last note faded into silence, Eleanor opened her eyes. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was racing. She was afraid to look up, afraid to see the same disappointment she had seen so many times before. But when she finally raised her head, she saw something she did not expect. Patricia Holloway was standing completely still, her arms no longer crossed, her mouth slightly open. Her face had gone pale. She looked like someone who had just witnessed something impossible. And Pastor Thomas was smiling. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The sanctuary was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the evening air outside. Eleanor sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, waiting for someone to say something, waiting for Patricia to find some reason to reject her, waiting for the dream to fall apart like it always did. But Patricia did not laugh. She did not roll her eyes. She did not make a cruel comment about librarians or hobbies or wasted time. She just stood there, staring at Eleanor like she was seeing her for the first time. It was Pastor Thomas who finally broke the silence. Well, he said softly, I think we found our pianist. Patricia blinked. She looked at the pastor, then back at Eleanor, then back at the pastor again. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like she wanted to argue but could not find the words. Finally, she cleared her throat and straightened her blazer. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked. Her voice was different now. Quieter. Less sharp. Eleanor swallowed hard. My grandmother taught me. She was a concert pianist. I studied music in college, but I stopped playing a long time ago. I only started again a few months ago. Well, Mon. Patricia stared at her for another long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Almost to herself. I see. She paused. We have rehearsals every Tuesday and Thursday evening. 7 weeks until the festival. Can you commit to that schedule? Eleanor felt her heart leap. Yes. Good. Patricia turned and walked toward the door. She stopped just before leaving and looked back over her shoulder. Do not be late. And just like that, Eleanor became the new pianist for the Grace Community Church Choir. The next 7 weeks were the hardest and most wonderful of her life. Rehearsals were intense. Patricia was demanding and precise, pushing the choir to hit every note perfectly, to blend their voices into something greater than the sum of its parts. She pushed Eleanor too. She handed her complex arrangements filled with runs and chords that required hours of practice. She expected perfection, and she did not accept excuses. But something had changed between them. Patricia no longer mocked her or dismissed her. She treated Eleanor like a professional, like someone whose talent she respected. It was not friendship, exactly. Patricia was not the warm and friendly type, but it was something close to acceptance. And for Eleanor, that was enough. The choir members were surprised at first. Many of them remembered her failed audition. They whispered among themselves, wondering how the shy librarian had transformed into this confident pianist who made the old grand piano sing like it never had before. But as the weeks passed and they heard her play night after night, the whispers turned into admiration. People started greeting her by name. They saved her a seat during breaks. They asked about her grandmother and her music and her life. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Eleanor felt like she belonged somewhere. The night before the festival, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What if she made a mistake? What if her fingers froze up at the worst possible moment? What if she let everyone down after they had put so much faith in her? She got out of bed and walked to the living room where the Steinways sat waiting in the darkness. She did not turn on the lights. She just sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. And then she talked to her grandmother. I wish you were here, she whispered into the silence. I wish you could see what is happening. I am so scared, Grandma. I am scared I am going to fail. I am scared I am not good enough. She waited, half expecting to hear a response. Of course, none came. But as she sat there, in the quiet, she felt something shift inside her chest. A warmth, a peace, a gentle reminder that she was not alone, that her grandmother's spirit lived on in every note she played, that the music itself was her connection to the woman who had believed in her when no one else did. Eleanor took a deep breath and played a soft melody, one of the first songs her grandmother had ever taught her. Simple, beautiful, full of love. And by the time she finished, the fear had faded. In its place was something stronger, something unshakable. She was ready. The Regional Gospel Music Festival was held in a massive auditorium in Columbus. 12 churches from 5 states had come to compete. The seats were filled with hundreds of people, families and friends and music lovers who had traveled from all over to watch. Backstage, the Grace Community Church Choir huddled together, nervous and excited. Patricia paced back and forth, giving last-minute instructions. Eleanor sat alone in a corner, her eyes closed, her fingers moving silently in her lap as she visualized the music. When their turn came, they walked out onto the stage together. The lights were blinding. The audience was a sea of shadows beyond the glare. Eleanor made her way to the grand piano at the center of the stage and sat down. She could feel her heart pounding, but her hands were steady. She looked out at the choir, at Patricia standing tall in front of them, at the faces of people who had become her friends over the past 2 months. Patricia raised her baton. The auditorium fell silent. And then, Eleanor began to play. The music poured out of her like a river. It filled the stage, the seats, the entire building. It lifted the voices of the choir and carried them higher than they had ever gone before. Eleanor played with everything she had, every ounce of love and pain and hope and joy she had ever felt. She played for her grandmother. She played for the little girl who had dreamed of this moment. She played for every person who had ever been told they were not good enough. When the final note rang out and faded into silence, there was a pause. 1 heartbeat. 2. And then the audience erupted. People rose to their feet. They clapped and cheered and shouted. Some of them were crying. Eleanor sat at the piano, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her own face. She looked at the choir and saw them hugging each other, laughing, celebrating. She looked at Patricia and saw something she had never seen before. The woman was smiling, really smiling, and there were tears in her eyes too. They won first place. For the first time in 15 years, Grace Community Church took home the top prize at the regional festival. When they announced the results, the choir screamed with joy. Pastor Thomas rushed onto the stage to congratulate them. Strangers came up to Eleanor and shook her hand, telling her they had never heard piano playing like that in their lives. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the auditorium grew quiet, Patricia approached Eleanor. She stood there for a moment, looking uncomfortable, like she was searching for the right words. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "What I said to you at that audition was wrong. I judged you without knowing who you really were. And I almost cost this choir the best pianist we have ever had." Eleanor looked at her. She thought about all the anger she had carried, all the hurt, all the nights she had replayed Patricia's cruel words in her head. And then she let it go. "Music has a way of surprising us all," she said softly. Patricia nodded. "Yes, it does." They stood there for a moment longer. 2 women who had started as enemies and ended as something closer to allies. Then Patricia extended her hand, and Eleanor shook it. That night, Eleanor drove home alone. She walked into her apartment, sat down at her grandmother's Steinway, and played one last song. A quiet melody. A thank you. A promise to never hide again. She had spent most of her life being invisible. But not anymore. Now, the whole world had heard her play. And she knew, deep in her heart, that her grandmother had heard it too.